Hi, it's Steve Hargadon, and welcome to the Future of Education. It's the 13th of December, 2012, and our guest tonight is Cal Newport, a return guest. Welcome, Cal.
Thanks for having me back, Steve.
Really delighted to have you on the show. The book is So Good They Can't Ignore You, Why Skills Trump Passion and the Quest for Work You Love. Future of Education is a Web 2.0 Labs project, thanks to Mighty Bell and Blackboard Collaborate. The Hack Your Education Tour for this year is now over. Lots of content up on the site. Peggy, I think you're in the room. The Phoenix photos and scribed material are up there. The Learning 2.0 Conference, Library 2.0 1.2, and the Global Education Conference all happened within the last few months, and all those recordings are free and available. There, you can find links at web20labs.com or my website. Coming up next year, we're going to do a school leadership summit that TCAL is sponsoring, a worldwide STEM conference that HP is sponsoring, the Reform Symposium, and a worldwide homeschool conference, which should be a lot of fun. Coming up on the Future of Education, next week we talk to Adam Fry, who's going to talk about a paper he's written on EdTech entrepreneurism that I think will really be valuable, looking at the current EdTech bubble and the massive infusion of cash into companies that don't have any real revenue plan in the EdTech world, and potentially the dangers for those who are beginning to depend on those programs. David Risher from worldreader.org is going to come on, and we're going to have a special show on student journalism and as the 21st century curriculum. Anyway, lots more. Finally, talking about Deming, Gavin Dykes on Student Voice, and some really fun things, Howard Rheingold on pedagogy, and a show just on agency and education. If you've missed any of the shows, they are all recorded. Ray McNulty, lovely visit with Ray from Penn Foster, really worth listening to, really like what Ray has to say. Before that, Stacy Roshan is a math teacher who flips her own classroom, and lots of really good lessons there for what works and what doesn't work in flipping. Anyway, lots more, over 300 shows, all free, all up in recorded versions. So this is where our studio audience gets to tell us where they're listening from. Look to the left of the map. You're looking for the star icon. You're clicking on it twice and then click on the map. I am back in Park City. Just got here about an hour ago. Really delighted to be home. Although moving from Phoenix to Boston to Utah with the weather switches, I think I wish I were back in Phoenix, Peggy. Feel free to put your location, time, weather. It looks like a couple from South America. Delighted to have you here. Interestingly, an America-centric crowd. That hasn't been the usual for us. Maybe this Follow Your Passions conversation is uniquely American in some way. I can't believe that would be true North and South America, but who knows? Lots of fun. Can't wait to have this discussion wherever you're listening from, or if you're listening to the recording. Thanks so much for joining us. There is a Mighty Bell space for tonight's show. Mighty Bell is the curation and content and conversation space, a new project by Gina Bianchini. I do consult for her, so there's full disclosure, but this is a free service, and here's a site that has links to different projects Cal has worked on, and you are most welcome to participate in a threaded discussion there. Okay, Cal, so I had the most interesting experience reading this book. I read it on 2 plane flights today, and I literally wanted to jump out of my seat several times. Tell me what kind of feedback you're getting.
Well, there's 2 common responses. So the sort of headline of the book is that follow your passion is bad advice if your goal is to end up passionate about what you do. The 2 most common responses I get is, one, someone saying, finally, I'm freed from that sort of simplistic bromide, and now I can actually get on with the more complicated work of taking control of my career. And the second most common reaction I get is people who misunderstand, and they think when I'm saying don't follow your passion that I'm saying don't follow the goal of ending up passionate about your work. And that's not at all what I'm saying. I want to end up passionate about my work. I want other people to be passionate about their work. I just think follow your passion as a strategy is a bad way to get there. So that's the sort of dual reaction. People who are very excited to finally hear that said, and people who are horrified.
Sorry, my mic was muted. So you've been on the show before. The interview was around how to be a high school superstar. I really enjoyed that show. I quote from the book often, and I recommend it almost weekly to somebody. You were going to come on earlier, but there's been an event in your family life. Everybody healthy? Mom, baby?
That's right. Yeah, Mom's healthy, and our 5-week-old son, Max, is sleeping upstairs, hopefully.
I'm glad. Okay, so this isn't a book written for education, but we're going to get to talk about that tonight, I think, a little. There's an increasing narrative around this, and I think there's some nuance to that narrative that we'll get to explore. What I loved about the book was the format. One of the things I loved about the book was the format. It was really, really easy to understand the argument and the layout. And I'm going to give you an award. There's no name for this brand new award, but it's the best use of chapter subheadings to make it really clear exactly what's going on in the book.
Yeah, I'm glad you appreciated that. I have to give credit to my editor who kept saying, people are going to read this on the plane, exactly how you did. So don't be too subtle about it. Be clear about what you're saying, even if you feel like you're hitting people over the head, because people aren't going to spend hundreds of hours nuancedly reading your book like you're an expert philosopher. Be clear, and I'm glad that came through.
Yes, you not only do a really good job in that way, but you often, well, at the end of each of the major sections, you kind of retell the argument up to that point in time. So let's talk about kind of how that shapes up. So the first section is don't follow your passion. And the message is that passions aren't just wrong, but they can be dangerous. Or following your passion isn't just wrong, but it can be dangerous.
Right. So
then it's be so good they can't ignore you.
Yep.
There's a little bit of a lag, so go ahead.
No, please continue. Yep.
Though the be so good they can't ignore you comes from a Steve Martin quote. Then there's turn down a promotion, about the importance of control. And then there's think small, act big. And that's really the core, right? The 4 pieces of the argument.
Yeah, that's right. It's don't follow your passion. That's the sort of premise that follow your passion is bad advice. And the other 3 rules are about what works instead.
Okay, so let's start with some things I really liked. So in addition to the structure and the summaries, I really liked the focus on the importance of ability or expertise. It feels like this is largely missing often in the education conversation. And I'm not quite sure why, because it seems so self-evident. Is it missing in the general public conversation as well about work?
I think so. So I'm in education. I'm a college professor, and I've been writing before this 3 books for a student audience. So this is something I've thought a lot about in the context of education, and now that I'm writing and thinking about the more general context of people and their careers, I see the same issue is still alive, which is, be it as a student or be it as someone trying to shape a career into something remarkable, the capital you have is your ability, what you can do that's valuable that other people can't do. And the key point is this is actually building ability is not something that's natural to a lot of people. It can be kind of uncomfortable. It's something that we should talk about We should discuss more the importance of getting good, what it feels like, the focus it takes. And I think in the career and job context, this advice that, well, if you just figure out what you're passionate about and follow it, you'll love your work, has basically overclouded that reality that skilled workers have known for millennia. So now we're walking around with this idea that if you just do something you really like, everything will work out. And we're missing this whole more nuanced conversation about the role of skill and the patience required to build it and the big role that plays in happiness.
So, gosh, I wish I had prepared better for this particular question, but it just occurred to me. Who wrote The Dumbest Generation? Maybe somebody in the chat can remember. I can't believe I'm blanking on his name. But in the process of that interview, I said to him, okay, so how much of this is hyperbole? And is there a much more nuanced discussion behind this? And he kind of admitted it was a little bit of marketing hyperbole. You admit kind of later in the book that you were looking to say something that was remarkable. Is that at the expense, do you think, of a little bit of nuance here?
Well, so what I feel about this passion concept is that there is a very small number of people for whom they have a clear pre-identified passion that matches to a knowledge work career. And by following it, things work out for them. And they have happiness in their career from the beginning and have very little doubt. These type of people aren't reading career advice guides about how to shape their career, how to find happiness. They know what they're doing. For 99% of the rest of the people, I think this advice actually makes them worse, right? That there's two problems with this idea that you should follow your passion. One, most people don't have pre-existing passions. And two, a compelling, fulfilling, happiness-producing career takes a lot more than simply matching your work to something that you really like. So for these people, I think saying follow your passion is the de facto device puts them in a worse situation. It reduces their possibilities of being happy about their work. So I'm strong when I say that's bad advice, even though for some people it might be good advice, because I think we'll save a lot more on happiness and do a lot more good with that sort of minor hyperbole.
So it's interesting because I think to some degree this may relate to how you define the word passion, or at least the advice of follow your passion, what that phrase actually means. Because almost every story you tell is a story of serendipity where interest drove somebody to try something, then they built skill, and then those skills came into play that ultimately led them to something that provided them with what's called a mission. I might have used the word passion to describe what I just described without the word passion, but it does seem to me that there's a sort of a reinforcing cycle between interest and skills that led me to respond kind of negatively at first to this don't follow your passions message.
Yeah, I think there is a sort of semantic nuance here that's really important. For too many people, especially people in my generation, which is Generation Y, a younger generation, passion has become a noun. It's something that exists, and you just have to discover it. And if you do introspection, you figure out this is my passion, just like you can say this is my eye color or this is my dog, right? People think about it as a noun. You find it, and then you can make career decisions based off of it. Where the reality is passion tends to be more like an adverb for most people. It's a way of approaching work. It's a way of approaching your work life. It can also be thought of as sort of a side effect of a career that is pushed in the right direction. So interest plays a role in this, but it's very different, right? For the people I profile, the fact that they're interested in something might get them started down a path that builds passion for them. But that's different than the way that people are defining passion when they're thinking about career and giving this advice, follow your passion. People are thinking about passion in that context as a calling, or the one thing that you're really meant to do. And the point I'm making is that most people don't have a one true calling. Interest is important, but many people have many different interests, and any one of them can be the foundation of a career they feel passionate about. So I'm trying to move passion away from this notion as a noun, something that exists, your one true calling, and think about it instead as sort of the side effect of a career that's well executed. So don't go searching for it in advance. Have that your goal for the career that you're working on now.
Right, and we're going to get a chance to dig down on all of this. But it is intriguing because your first story isn't the story of Steve Jobs, it's the story of the monk. But the Steve Jobs story, it's really hard to define that as something other than his kind of following his interests, right? And there is some nuance there, right? I mean, what's the difference between a guy who sort of passionately wants to not wear shoes, if we can use the word passion there. I mean, there is a sense about him that he is not moving in a direction, but that the things that he does, he kind of does wholeheartedly, and then he fails and he moves forward to something else, and then he has sort of a serendipitous moment of success, and it leads to sort of integrating different things in his life, and then there are major career failures. I'm still struggling a little with not using the word passion for a guy like that.
Well, I think passion is an appropriate word there, but again, when you use it as an adverb and not as a noun. So what Steve Jobs did not do was follow the standard advice of how most people understand it, which is to say, figure out in advance, this is what I'm meant to do, and then pursue that one thing wholeheartedly and live happily ever after. What Steve Jobs did instead is he just lived his life in general passionately. Whatever he was involved in, he would go all in. But there was no notion that he had a vision in advance that he was going to build a remarkable life out of technology entrepreneurship. In fact, he stumbled serendipitously, as I tell the story in the book, into the opportunity that became Apple Computer. And once that built up, he did derive quite a bit of satisfaction and happiness out of it. But the point was, he did not figure out in advance, this is my passion.
Good. Sorry.
But instead, he lived his life passionately.
There's a little bit of a lag, which is rare in this environment, and I think maybe Carolyn's experiencing it a little as well. There's about a 1 to 2 second lag between when you speak and I do. So, Cal, I apologize for stepping on your words there. So I love that you brought deliberate practice in. I don't feel like we talk about this enough, and especially I liked your focus on how difficult deliberate practice is, and the story you tell about your own guitar experiences. And I'm trying to remember the name of the guitarist, Jordan. And Jordan. Do you want to describe a little bit? We did have Dan Coyle on the show who wrote a book called The Talent Code. But do you want to describe a little sort of your feelings about deliberate practice?
Sure, yeah. And Dan Coyle it's a great book. In fact, I liked his review of my book. He talked about how we think about our passion as Spanish pirate treasure that we're trying to discover, and that it's more complicated than that. So I think we're of the same mindset. So something I talk a lot about in the book is that when you study people who do end up loving what they do, the key is not that they match their work to a pre-existing passion. Their key is that they got really good at valuable things and then use that as leverage to take control of their career. So the question was, how do people get really good at rare and valuable things? Because most people don't. And that's what turned my attention to deliberate practice. That is the type of hard practice that musicians or athletes or professional chess players use to systematically stretch their skills. And something I observed is that the people in, say, knowledge work that did end up becoming remarkable, like Steve Jobs, implicitly started using deliberate practice to build their skills. That is, they would purposefully stretch themselves. Deliberate practice is uncomfortable because you're pushing yourself beyond where you're already good at doing something. You're forcing new skills to form. Dan Coyle would say that you have new myelin forming on your nerves. Psychologists like Anders Ericsson would say we don't know what's happening in your brain, but this is the type of action that matters. But the point is, it's uncomfortable. And when you look around at students and you look around at people in knowledge work, most people avoid that discomfort. So I was fascinated in my book by the idea that if you pick up a comfort with that discomfort, if you work at stretching and building skills like the guitar players, like Jordan Tice, the guitar player I interviewed, would stretch his fingers literally to learn how to play new licks, that you'll have a very quick jump in ability, and with that you'll get a quick jump in leverage, which will allow you to have more control over your career, get more happiness out of it.
And you also talk about how that can actually almost physically hurt your brain. And I know exactly what you're talking about, right? It's the willingness to push yourself to think harder than you're used to for the ultimate outcome of being a better thinker.
Yeah, so if you look at a musician, so in the book I sat down with a guitar player who started playing guitar at the same age that I did. And by the time we had both been playing for 6 years, I was in a mediocre high school rock band that couldn't win a battle of the bands, and he was professionally touring. And I was, what's the difference? So I sat down and I watched him practice, and it was strain. He would strain himself when he practiced physically to try to actually build up the speed of his playing. That's how he got better. It's the same thing with intellectual pursuits, the type of pursuits that you would do in education or knowledge work. To build a new skill, to understand a new type of math technique or a new function in a complex piece of software, your mind is stretching in the same way that Jordan Tice's fingers would stretch when he was trying to build up the speed on a lick. And it's uncomfortable. It can also be very fulfilling. You're building skill, but it's uncomfortable. Now, this is something that craftsmen for millennia were very comfortable with because this was the whole culture around skilled labor, but we've lost this culture with knowledge work. We don't have a whole culture that's sort of supporting this type of discomfort and systematic stretching of our abilities. And it's something that I think would be good for us to bring back, and it's an idea that I explore.
Yeah, I have a specific memory in my own life. I bought the relational database program Paradox, and I literally stayed up for 3 days with almost no sleep because it was so incredibly challenging, but opened up so many new vistas to me. And I think many of us have had that kind of experience, but it is intriguingly not something we talk a lot about. Although I want to, the connection I would make here is I in my blog post on this interview, I sort of said I want to push back a little on some of this because it feels to me like one part of my role as a parent is to meld both the interest and or non-unique passion, the willingness to work passionately or things that they're deeply interested in, to the understanding of the importance of that kind of skill building, so that they can do something that they really like. And our oldest daughter, who just graduated from college, does theater for kids with autism. And certainly that's been her dream for years, and she's actually doing it and been successful, I think, in large part because she has done the legwork. We'll move on from that because I'm still struggling a little with the distinction.
Well,
okay,
yeah.
So I also really loved the usefulness piece. Go ahead. There's a lag here. I apologize.
Well, yeah, I was just going to step in there briefly because there's a subtle interplay, which I think is really interesting, between the legwork being a prerequisite for passion, which is an argument I make, that the better people become at things, the more passionate they get about them, which is why it doesn't make sense to start with the passion and think that that's all you need to do. But there's also this argument that I often get pushed back about, which is if you don't have deep passion in the first place, you can't put in the legwork. And it seems like an interesting paradox, but when you study stories and you study the sort of evidence, the sort of studies of virtuosos, for example, the evidence points to the idea that you do not need a deep passion in advance to put in the legwork that builds up to passion. Right? There's not actually a chicken and the egg problem. What happens is that interest is enough to get you started because that gives you intrinsic motivation. And then you get a snowball effect. That lets you push a little bit harder, get a little bit better. That gives you some more ability, which gives you more sense of identity and sort of interest in what you're doing, which allows you to go up to the next step. And it snowballs, so your passion sort of grows with it. So that's an important distinction I often make for people. It's a myth that you need deep passion to put in the type of deep work that leads people to remarkable things. It really is more of a snowball effect. A little bit of interest gets you a little bit better, which can build up a little bit more interest, and it builds from there.
I love the concept as well of being useful, which relates to actually having real quality, that you're offering something. And intriguingly for me, I find that the kids who are using Instagram are experiencing in a very tangible way the ability to craft something, create. I mean, I was a photographer when I was in high school, and it was sort of a deep interest of mine. But kids who are interested in photography now can actually take pictures and get feedback and get into a quality loop from the feedback that I think is really healthy. Would you see that as healthy as well?
Yes, feedback is a key piece of the sort of deliberate practice that builds up skills. It's one of the advantages of the internet, if used properly, is that you can put things out there and get feedback. If, I learned how to computer program on our sort of home computer back in the 80s and early 90s sort of in isolation. Today, you can try to become a contributor to an open source project, and you're going to get harsh feedback on your first sort of source commits because you have people really staring at it. And I think that's great. And it's important to keep in mind, I think, that if in your job, for example, if you're not receiving a lot of the sort of direct feedback for what you're working on, you need to seek it, because without it, it's very difficult to build up those sort of quality loops that you talk about.
Good. So I'm just going to keep going here with things I liked about the book. You used the phrase, the importance of working right instead of the right work, and I think we've kind of discussed that already, but it's a phrase that's very memorable for me, at least. Yeah, and that that captures the sort of basic idea that stop obsessing whether this is the right job for you. The formula that builds people to real passion is that they focus on building skills and then using those as leverage. So in other words, working right is going to get you farther than obsessing about finding the right work. And then before we kind of dive into some other topics, you talk about the value of having control. And this was fascinating for me because a lot of the language you use around the ultimately building up enough career capital to have control in what you do is reminiscent of sort of the narrative around work when I was graduating from high school, right? Work hard, develop skills, and then you'll ultimately be able to do what you want to do. And we talk a lot now about not having to go through that process because of the long tail and the opportunities that are there. But I also think that this whole concept of building up enough value that you can control your options is really important. Yeah, and this is this example is sort of the central idea of the system in the book for how people end up loving what they do for a living. So it says you build up these skills that gives you what I call career capital. And then the important thing is that you invest that career capital for the type of traits that really lead people to love their work. And when I spent time with a variety of different people, from Ivy League educated organic farmers to screenwriters to venture capitalists, I found that a big source of their happiness, their love for their work, is they had a lot of autonomy or control over what they did. Having control over your livelihood is so powerful that, and it shows up so often when you study people who love their work, that I actually call it the dream job elixir in my book, because it seems to be that sort of magic ingredient that leads people to love their work. But the key seems to be that in order to gain great autonomy over what you do and be successful at it, you have to have that skill first to trade in advance. And you mentioned the long tail before. Well, I think this is actually a sort of cautionary tale, especially for younger people, that many of them are trying to make a jump into autonomy without the skills first to back it up. And they figure, well, I'll start a blog on some topic, and then I'll have full control over my life. I'll just make money off of there. And then no money comes, because they haven't really put in the legwork to build real value in a very difficult value marketplace, even with a long tail environment. And so they have autonomy, but they have no money to pay for food, for example. So control comes with its own traps. So I say it's very, very valuable, but the sort of warning is don't try to jump into more control if you don't really have that capital to back it up. It all comes back to first having that capital, which becomes your leverage for pushing and prying your career into more and more fulfilling directions. So Steve Jobs didn't have any capital when he was choosing to live with no money, sleeping on other people's floors, and eating at whatever shelter he was eating at. But it was when he actually was producing something of value to somebody else that he could begin to make choices.
Yes, that's absolutely right. So Steve Jobs, pre-Apple, was wandering, right? He was trying to figure out what he wanted to do with his life. He was trying to figure out the meaning of life. And he wasn't someone that you would describe as being really happy and fulfilled with their life. He was out there, he was seeking and having a hard time at it. If you fast forward to, say, the end of year one of Apple Computer, you find a much more fulfilled and sort of actualized Steve Jobs, because at that point, he was in charge of a company that was very valuable and that was producing something that was very valuable. And this gave him great autonomy. Autonomy not like before where he was barefoot and poor, but autonomy in the sense of he was actually having an impact on the world and having a say in how it was happening. And that's where you see a Steve Jobs who is really passionate about what he's doing for a living.
Is there any degree to which seeing financial success as the ultimate goal here changes this at all? Meaning, what if I'm somebody who really cares about an issue, like the wife at the farm, and I maybe fall into something that's successful, but maybe I just end up working for a small organic farm for the rest of my life, and it's not highly financially successful, but I'm very happy with that work. How does that play in?
Finances are interesting. My sort of favorite philosophy around the role that money plays came from the entrepreneur Derek Sivers, who I interviewed in the book about this very question. And so Derek Sivers, for those who don't know, he's sort of a famous entrepreneur who went on, he's done a lot of very successful TED Talks, which is how he's more broadly known, but he is clearly someone who does not care about financial gain for the sake of financial gain, as evidenced by the fact that when he sold his first company for millions, he put all the money into a charitable trust. He didn't want it. So he's not someone who's driven by financial gain, but he told me when I interviewed him that money plays a very important role in building a life where you have control and impact and happiness over what you did, because he says money is a great neutral indicator of value. People don't like to give up money. They're happy to say, that sounds great, I'll come to your blog, I'll friend you on a social network, but they do not like giving up money. They really want to have value in exchange. So his philosophy, which I think is a good one, is that you know you're doing something of value if people will give you money for it. It doesn't have to be millions of dollars, but his simple rule was he wouldn't move on to another project until he was making enough money from that it could support himself. And that was his evidence that what he was doing was actually valuable and that he should make that move into doing that more full time. So I like that idea. Don't seek money for the sake of money, but use it as this very powerful and neutral indicator of what you're doing is or is not valuable to the greater world.
But that depends on a definition of value that means value to other people, like David puts in the chat there, Gandhi. But I mean, there are people who do things that are valuable to humanity who often don't get rewarded for it, right?
Let's go back to your organic farm example, right? If you felt really strongly, like the farmers I profiled in the book, about, say, organic farming and produce, well, if you had no care for anyone ever paying you for it, you could just sort of volunteer on farms, and you might feel okay about yourself, but you probably weren't actually having much impact on that world, and therefore weren't really going to feel like you're having impact and sort of autonomy. But on the other hand, if you could run a successful CSA that supports you, or get hired in a staff position at an organic farm where you're getting a full salary, that means you actually are bringing value to the table, and therefore you're actually making an impact about this thing you care about. So it is sort of a fine line. If no one's paying you for something, you have to be careful whether or not you actually are producing value and how much impact you're actually having, how much control you have. On the other hand, if you keep wanting more and more money, you can get stuck in these sort of loops. And as you say, for many fields, it's sort of the total quantum of money is not that relevant. So I think this idea that money is a neutral indicator of value, use it cautiously, but use it as such, is sort of a smarter, nuanced way of approaching, how do I do something worthwhile, or how do I do something of value?
Good. This is generating lots of fun chat. Yeah, I think using it cautiously is probably a good landing place there, because there are people. I read a great review the other day of, I can't remember where it was, but it was about how movies all have this sort of happy ending thing right now. And it was around books. And that there are great classics of literature in which there is not a happy ending. I mean, a person does something of value that's noble, and it doesn't end up happily. And we often put too much value on there being a happy ending. And I think there's an intriguing movement within a new generation where the car isn't important, the career isn't important. And it's not that they're lazy, but they don't see the same reward system that has driven a lot of us.
Well, here's what psychology, social psychology tells us. The things that are important if you want to feel motivated or satisfied is having a sense of autonomy is important. Having a sense of mastery, that you're good at something that people value, is important. Having strong relationships with people is important. Having a sense of impact on the world. We know these things lead people to satisfaction, and they're sort of orthogonal to whether or not you have a nice car or a big house. But how do you get to a place where you have real autonomy, you have a sense of mastery, you're really making an impact on the world? How do you get to those type of traits? Well, this is where the fact that people are hiring you, that people are promoting you, that you're turning down job offers that other people have, that your book ideas are being sold or what have you. This is where money is telling you that you are building up the type of value that you will be able to trade for real autonomy, real mastery, real impact, these sorts of traits. And I think this is what my generation is catching on to. They could care less whether or not they have a nice car for a nice car. They want autonomy, mastery, impact, great connections with people, and impact on the world. But in order to do that, they need to have skills that are valuable, or they're just going to be left in the dust.
So Gandhi actually becomes a really good lens, his life becomes a really good lens through which to see this, because he was a relatively unsuccessful lawyer. He had difficulty speaking in the courtroom. He was too shy, and moved to South Africa, kind of discovers himself in a community where he gives value to promoting the rights of Indians, and then sort of increasingly builds capability, skill, understanding. The money's not actually a part of that story for him really at all, but it is a story of being able to accomplish something of value where the passion follows the events that took place that led him to make a difference in certain areas.
Right, and Gandhi, like other examples, for example, like Martin Luther King, who maybe I'll use an example here because I just finished reading a biography of him, so I'm a little bit more up to date on the details. But people like Martin Luther King or Gandhi worked really hard at what they were doing. And I think that's what separated them from the thousands of other people who may have felt strongly about those same issues and felt strongly that these are issues that people should do something about, and maybe donated some money to various organizations. But what separated a Gandhi or a Martin Luther King is they worked really hard. And when they saw opportunities, they really went after them, because they realized that to actually have a real impact in this was very hard to do, and they built up real value. So King built up this whole movement, this whole sort of style of oratory and organization, and was able to build a movement that was very, very hard. But by doing so, he had huge autonomy and impact on the world and this great legacy. So he's a great example. Gandhi's a great example of fulfillment, satisfaction, impact. A life well lived is a life that has a lot of sort of hard, focused work in it.
So I want to take you back to How to Be a High School Superstar and kind of make a connection with this work. I was reminded of that when you talked about the Canadian college students whose passions were not actually related to their careers, but were sports or music or something else. And kind of the message that I got from How to Be a High School Superstar of actually being authentically interested in something and really diving deep. So there is value in learning these skills in something that maybe is unrelated to career, right? But that then those skills or that understanding of the value of being skilled translates over into the next thing you do?
That definitely happens. I think there's evidence, for example, that students who pursue music seriously have successes in other endeavors of life later on, because music, same thing with sports, are arenas where you get practice in doing something hard. Playing that instrument is very, very hard because you can't do it at first, and it actually takes quite a bit of hard work before you can even make anything that resembles a song. And then over the years you get better at it and get those rewards. Once you've had that experience, learning how to play the French horn at the age of 11 to 15 or something like that, you then could hopefully remember that when you're faced with your entry-level job at trying to figure out how the sort of Salesforce.com API works out, and realizing that that's like playing the French horn. You have no idea how to do it, and it might take you 100 hours, but if you spend the 100 hours, you're going to be 100 hours better at it, and that'll be real value. So I think what you're saying there is absolutely true. And this is, in my mind, one of the great points of a liberal arts education, if you get a liberal arts education, is that you're practicing tackling hard intellectual challenges, what that feels like, what sort of persistence that takes. And that's going to be very applicable to almost any knowledge work career.
So one of the interesting things that I watch is this shift in the role of institutions, right? And it feels like in a lot of areas there's a deinstitutionalization taking place, where the institution has less power and less control. And those institutions also held, in a lot of cases, the authority to recognize accumulated capital. But sometimes they didn't, right? Sometimes there were actually ways in which they would fight against somebody accumulating that kind of capital. Is there a larger historical shift here that will that is or will change how we think about this craftsman mindset and when and where we invest our time and energy?
It's an interesting question. It seems like the direction we're heading is that we're sort of decentralizing the judging of capital and the value of capital, and that this is probably a good thing. So back in a more institutionalized time, so we had much more narrow definitions of what was valuable and what was not valuable and how that was measured. I think in an age of digital communications, in the age of the internet with fluid markets and fluid sort of communications and way for people to find markets, it's much more easy for a huge diversity of capital types to actually find an audience and be valued, right? This is sort of Kevin Kelly's 1,000 True Fans theory. And I think that's an exciting thing for people, especially in my young generation. There isn't just 2 or 3 major directions you can go to become valuable to society. There's actually now any number of diverse ways that you can build value in something and find an audience and find patrons and build a great movement or career out of it. So I think that's one of the more exciting directions, but it calls for a much more sophisticated conversation about careers and happiness than simply telling people, figure out what you're meant to do at the age of 18 and just go do it.
Yeah, when you're talking about control, you actually talk about one of the, I'm going to say the word problem, but I'm not sure that's what you said, challenge or problem, that the more that you gain the skill, actually the more afraid people might be that you would leave. How does that actually play out?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's sort of 2 traps surrounding control, and they're on either end of the value spectrum. So the first trap we already talked about. People try to make the move to more autonomy before they have the value to back it up, and they just end up penniless, right? It doesn't work. Just because you want to have a nonprofit that helps change the world, if you haven't built up any sort of capital or real value or ideas, it's not going to work. But on the other side of things, I kept finding in my research that people who actually did build up real value and wanted to make moves to new control found that it's exactly when you are valuable that the current employer or the current organization where you are is going to do whatever they can to stop you and try to prevent you from making that move, and instead just re-aim that talent towards going up their ladder or going up a sort of career path that's good for their organization. So in some sense, that's even the more dangerous of the traps surrounding control, is that once you have value, how do you build the confidence to actually take that value out for a spin and say, I don't want the promotion to assistant VP where I'm going to have to work 30 more hours and have 20 more people under me and my life's going to be more stressful. I actually want to move to the New Hampshire office and go to a 3-day-a-week schedule, but my pay is high enough now that my part-time pay is like my old pay used to be or whatever. That's really sort of more difficult, is what do you do when you actually have the skill, because that's when the old institutions are going to try to stop you from going your own way.
Okay, there was an interesting question that came up in the chat, and it was the question of, what do you tell an 18-year-old? So you meet an 18-year-old, you've just written this book. I know what you would have, I think I know what you would have told them after How to Be a High School Superstar, but you have 3 minutes with a teenager in the elevator, and they ask you what your book is about. What do you say?
I would tell them, there's not one thing that you are hardwired to do that you have to discover before you'll be happy. You're young. If you're going to college, spend your next years exposing yourself to things, but more importantly, learning how to do hard intellectual things. And keep in mind that to build a life you love, what matters is how good you are at things, not whether or not you found the one sort of true match you're supposed to do. There is no one true passion waiting out there for you. You have to go develop passion, and getting good at things is how you're going to do it.
Now, how would Jordan have heard that?
Jordan Tice, the guitar player. So one thing I say in the book, for example, is, if you look at musicians and athletes, for example, they often end up in their field starting very early because you have to, if you're going to be really good at guitar, or really good at sort of a certain sport. But even then, it's wrong to assume that they all had an undying passion at the age of 9 that they identified. Often it's more arbitrary or complex than that. Jordan Tice, for example, had 2 parents who were bluegrass musicians. So it's natural that he picked up the guitar because that's what his parents were doing. That's what he saw they valued. He would go to shows with them. He was around it. So he said, okay, I'll play the guitar. But it would be false to think that he just woke up one day and said, this is what I'm meant to do. As he got better at it, and I tell his story in the book, he first started taking lessons with someone at the church, and then as he practiced, he got a little bit, he got better. He's like, this is good. He got approval from his parents, and he practiced harder. It built up, and he built up more and more passionate about it, and now he loves what he's doing. But even then, the idea that there is a strong pre-existing passion really is still very rare. Because the stories of how people who end up really good at things get started are often way more complex and nuanced.
So Gary Steger has a saying, he says, the best thing you can do for kids is to have them associate with interesting adults. And the most important thing that you can do is to become an interesting person. I really felt like the people you profiled in the book were interesting. I wanted to know them. I don't know that I'm saying her name right, but I want to know Pardis Sabeti. I want to know Kirk, the armchair archaeologist. It had to have been a lot of fun to get to know these people.
That was a significant part of my motivation. I mean, the main reason I wrote the book is that I was at a career crossroads, and I figured I need an answer to the question of how do people end up loving what they do for a living, because I wanted that advice myself. But the sort of secondary motivation was I wanted to hang out with these cool people. I wanted to hang out at the bluegrass frat house with Jordan Tice and go to the sort of fancy, floor-to-ceiling windowed Harvard office of Pardis Sabeti and tramps around the farm with, the Red Fire farmers and see how they weeded their carrots. And these people that was a lot of fun. And I have to admit, that was a secret but strong motivation for writing this book. It's an excuse to be around cool people and see cool things.
That's great. Okay, so we're going to move to Q&A. We've got just under 10 minutes. If you have a question for Cal, please feel free to put it in the chat or raise your hand. The hand icon is the third icon over, and it's in the participant windows, the hand. You'll see it if you raise your hand. I'll give you the microphone. While we're waiting for a question or two to come in, I joked in my blog post that I wondered if there was any connection between your message and arranged marriages, which anecdotally are said to often be happier than marriages of passion. Think there's a tie there?
Yeah, you're not any means the first person to ask me about arranged marriages, and understanding how relationships succeed or not is probably the next book I need to write. I think my wife would like me to research that book. I like the anecdote though, or the connection at least, right? This notion that in romantic love, people feel that it's all about finding the right person. However, it's arranged marriages often end up happier because there's other things that matter more than the initial match. I have no idea if that's true. I think I'll get in trouble no matter how I speculate an answer there, so I'll leave it at fascinating question.
Did you say I'm not the first one to ask it, or I am the first one?
You're maybe the third person to ask this.
That is so funny, because it actually has some really interesting and significant parallels. Anyway, should be fun to see how you respond to that. I think what we're watching is that you're sort of transparently growing. As you write the books, you're writing about things that are very much related to your own experiences. This is very clear in this book. The last portion of the book is largely about kind of where you are and what you're trying to do. So you're saying maybe your next book will be on relationships?
Well, or at least there's people in my family who maybe would like me to write that book. Any book that would get me out there trying to figure out how to make my wife happier would be a book that she would support me researching probably. But seriously, I don't know what my next one would be. I'm still trying to digest the lessons of this one in my working life.
I think it will be parenting. My guess is it's going to be a big topic for you.
Yeah, I've heard that too.
Okay, so we still have a couple of minutes left. I haven't seen a question. If you've put a question in the chat, I missed it, I apologize, but feel free to raise your hand. Okay, so Ben, you've raised your hand. I'm going to give you the microphone. To turn your mic on, you click on the talk button at the top. Oh, no mic. But did you want to ask a question? While Ben is typing, anyone else is welcome to grab the mic or ask a question in the chat. So I didn't actually have you tell a little bit of the story of your circumstance, but was it this fall that you started teaching?
Last fall. I started teaching last fall, and the quest I wrote in this book took place in the 2 years before that. So basically during the academic job hunt process and the time leading up to it, which was a sort of tumultuous time, is when I did most of the sort of research for the book.
So that was actually a year ago then from the start of this fall.
Yeah, that's right. I handed in the manuscript for this book last summer, right before I started at Georgetown. I actually timed it that way. I wanted to have this book and these ideas captured before I set foot to start the next chapter of my career.
Okay, so Ben has his question in the chat, and Thea, you'll be next. Ben wants to know, how do we teach authentic work skills in the classroom?
I think it's an interesting question. It's something I think about with my grad students. For example, how do I instill the sort of importance and the habits that surround authentic work, what I call deep work, which it might be the same thing Ben is talking about, this sort of focused work that gets the most out of your current abilities and also at the same time improves how good those current abilities are. How you teach that, I think, is one of the big questions probably of education in the 21st century. I think focus is the new IQ. If in the 20th century our big, concern was, how smart are you? That's what you need to succeed in this world. I think in the 21st century, the ability to focus on things, to pick up new skills, to resist distraction, to produce things of value is going to be the most valuable skill. So if we can figure out how to teach that, we're going to be doing a great service to a new generation of students.
Okay, Thea, you have mic privileges. To turn your mic on, it looks like you know what to do. Can we hear you?
Thanks, Steve. You guys hear me?
We can hear you.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Cal, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. I was just wondering, as you spoke to young people, what has their response and feedback been to you about this? Or their arguments, or just their comments?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the sort of younger the person, especially if they're in college or right outside of college, the more they seem to appreciate the message. So I did some research on this for an article I wrote for the Harvard Business Review website, where I actually went back and studied the occurrences of the phrase "follow your passion" in printed English literature using the Google Ngram viewer tool. And what I discovered is actually the term "follow your passion" didn't really pick up in usage until the late 80s, and really was used most heavily in the 90s into the early 2000s. So it's my generation, Generation Y, that was the first generation to be raised being told to follow your passion. And it's been a real problem, because as they're entering the workforce, they're looking around for a job that they immediately love and feel passionate about. And when they don't find that, it can be confusing and dispiriting. And I think this is part of the reason my generation is unfairly being labeled as being lazy or entitled. I think partially the problem is they're misinformed. They've been told this advice too much growing up. So I encounter a real sense of sort of relief and acceptance from young people who are saying, good, this advice was causing me more confusion and uncertainty, and it wasn't helping me, and I wanted something more specific, and it's better that we can move on from it. So of the audiences that appreciate the book, I think young people and the parents of young people living at home tend to be the two that are most receptive to the ideas.
Thea, that was a great question. Thank you so much. Cal, you probably remember this, but as a courtesy to our guests, we do finish on time. I want to thank you so much for being here. I'm clapping for you. It's hovering over the smiley face and hitting the applause. I'm saying that because it's hard to find, those of you who want to clap. Really, thanks so much for coming on again.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed the conversation.
I sure did too. The book is So Good They Can't Ignore You, Why Skills Trump Passion in the Quest for Work You Love, and it's Cal Newport. Thanks, Cal. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Have a great night.
Thank you.